what happens when you get that first or next promotion as a leader? Are you ready for that? For what our guest calls the leadership shock? Today, we're talking about transitioning well and leading better wherever you are in your career. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference in the world and for their teams and for their organizations as well. If you are listening to this podcast, you could be with us live in the future for episodes on your favorite social channel. To find out when those are happening and how to join us, you can join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. We're also on X, etc. But join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. And you can be in the know in the future. Today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Masterclasses, picked from 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become a more effective, productive, and confident leader while overcoming some of our toughest challenges as a leader. Learn more and go sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, let me bring in our guest. So if you're with us on video, you can see him. Let me introduce him to you. His name is Pete Steinberg. He is a leadership and innovation expert with extensive experience in consulting with top Fortune 500 professionals. He also has more than 20 years of experience as an elite rugby coach, coaching the USA women's rugby team at 2 World Cups and the Rio Olympics. As a former U.S. international and Olympic sports coach and commentator for major outlets such as CBS, ESPN, and Fox Sports, he has a track record of bringing teams to victory. He has won 11 national championships with Penn State women. Sorry, that's what you and I were talking about before we started.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Keep it in the Big Ten.
Anyway, with the Penn State women, the Marfew men and Temple women's rugby teams. He has also worked with the men's Eagles and other age group programs in the U.S. national team pathway. He was the head of coach development for USA Rugby, a leading program that's become integrated into world rugby programs. He's also the president of Innovative Thought, a business consultancy focused on leadership, organizational development. He regularly is an executive coach for senior executives at global companies. He's the author. Why he's here and how we met is because of his brand new book. If you're with us live, it hasn't even come out yet. But by the time you hear it on the podcast, it will be out. It's called Leadership Shock. Using authenticity to navigate the hidden dangers of career success. Pete, welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Sorry for saying Purdue instead of Penn State. I'm so glad you're here.
You know, Kevin, it's great to be here, and I appreciate the remarkable introduction. It's sort of one of those things when you hear it, that you sort of, it's like your life flashes before you in some of those cases. So well, I appreciate it.
That's right. I sometimes say when the roles are reversed, thank you for reading the introduction that my mother wrote for me, but it is kind of one of those moments, right? And I'm super glad, Pete, to be talking to you live before the book actually comes out, because having been at this moment with a number of books, I know how special it is. And it truly is a pleasure to have you here. So why don't we start kind of with that? Like, you obviously have all this rugby background, all this coaching background, and you also are a professor at a couple of universities, including Penn State. But like when you sort of have this moment to look back, tell us a little bit about the journey, I guess specifically how you end up doing this work and writing this book. Just in brief, like beyond, I gave the timeline, right? But
yeah, right.
Tell us a little bit about how you end up here.
Well, I think there's a couple of things, Kevin, and you find this. I was fortunate enough with my sports background that I was coaching elite teams while I was also executive coaching executives. And I found myself like transferring elite sport principles to business, and then also business principles to elite sport, right? It's all about performance and about high performance. And I found when I was working with executives, I kept coming across these same symptoms. Their calendar was crazy. They were fighting fires. Their teams were confused. And most importantly, they just couldn't feel like they could lead. And maybe a little bit longer than it should have taken. I was connecting these dots, and I'm like, I'm coming across the same symptom. I really need to start investigating what the causes are. And what I found was that the cause was this this challenge that what gets you to be promoted, all the roles and the way you lead, is not the thing that gets you successful in the next role. But as humans, we don't like to change, right? So
that is a
we
shock.
don't like to.
I have never heard that before, Pete.
Yeah.
That we don't like to change. But no, I love this because I co-wrote a book called From Bud to Boss about the transition into your first role as a leader, and that's why in the intro I framed this as around transitions. And I think what you call the shock, we'll talk about that in a second, can happen at any of those places. I think the higher we go, maybe it seems the more obvious, but let's just go there, right? And talk about what I hinted at this in the open as well, but you call it the leadership shock. What is it, and what do you mean by it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So I'm actually, I stole this. I was talking to a professor at the University of Colorado about the book that I was writing, and he said, well, that sounds like leadership shock. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's the term that describes. So when your body is in shock, you can breathe, your heart beats, like all of your organs work, but you can't actually do anything. And that's really what leadership shock is. Like I can survive. I'm in meetings. I'm meeting with my team.
Work is happening. Work is getting done.
Work is happening, but I don't have any control over what's actually happening around me. And it is most likely to happen in that transition to a new role. It can definitely happen in your first role. The one thing I would say in the first role is that you probably expect things to be different. Like I think that's like in fact, the chief learning officer,
self-awareness, right?
If you have any self-awareness, you're like, things have to be different. And in fact, the in the book, Maria Taylor, who's the chief learning officer at United Airlines, really talked about how leadership shock most often happens when there's an internal promotion. When I move to another company and I get headhunted or I get recruited across, again, I am more aware of things have to be different. But sometimes I get promoted in my own company, same desk, same email, same, like everything is the same. And therefore I think it's the same. And when you have spent, and this is actually where I see leadership shock, what happened the most is when I've spent 20 years at a company, when I have absolute belief that I know how this company works and I know everyone, that's actually where you're most likely to get leadership shock, because the big steps after 20 years are head of a division to an enterprise-wide position. Requires completely different leadership skills, right? Completely different leadership, a leadership approach. You have to think differently about how you lead. But if I've been in that company for 20 years and I've seen people in that enterprise-wide role, I'm like, I can do that. And so the shock happens when I'm not aware and I'm not intentional about how I need to change.
So it's about a blind spot. It's about, and you're basically describing in this conversation and in the book the fact that this is predictably going to happen to you, as you've wisely said, especially in those situations. I just want to make sure that whoever's listening, that it can still happen, or you could see it around you. Here's the question then, because you've now set the table for when it may be at its worst, right? Or when it's most likely to happen. But how do we know if we're in it? Because like you said, if we're in shock, we can still breathe. We can still, it's like you think about teams that are storming. I always say, work's still getting done.
That's right.
It's just really hard, right? Like, how do we know when we're in the shock?
Yeah. And I just want to be really, like, you're absolutely right. Like we, often, and if you read the book, it's about someone who becomes CEO, but leadership shock happens in it's a continuum, right? Because really, in the book is the authentic leadership model. And the authentic leadership model is a system that helps you be the best leader you can be, right? It doesn't matter where you are. I could be doing fine, but am I the best leader I can be? Am I spending the time where I should be spending? Like, it is that elite performer that wants to squeeze the most out of their leadership. And that's so to me, it's a never-ending journey, and it's probably like, I have a scientific background, so it's probably an asymptotic curve, right? That you can improve, and so I think that we're always in some kind of challenge. Like it's hard with the dynamic. Leadership shock can happen when I get a new boss, right? Or when the organization around me changes. I have to be more intentional to change. What's been really interesting in the work that I've done as an executive coach is that the authentic leadership model becomes a mindset. And so there's a case study in the book at the back. There's like 3 or 4 real examples of people that I've worked with through leadership shock. And there's a woman there that just recently took her first VP role. And I was talking to her, and she said, "Oh yeah, I went back and I looked at my authentic leadership model." Like unfortunately, Kevin, she doesn't need me anymore. Like, it's a really bad coaching business model.
No, it's a good.
She's like, no, she has the think. She knows how to think through it. So once you actually get that awareness, I mean, I talk about metacognition in the book. Once you actually develop the skills to be not just reflective, but thinking about why you believe the things that you believe, you will automatically recognize the symptoms of like, oh, I can't do that. Oh, why am I thinking that I can't do that? What is it? And it's that skill and that mindset that helps you continually evolve as a leader and be at your best.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned mindset, because I think there's a whole lot. I mean, there's practical stuff throughout this book, and we're going to talk about some of the components of the authentic leadership model, although we don't have time to do them all. Besides, you'll need to get a copy of Pete's book called Leadership Shock. So you make sure you do that. If you're listening, all of the links will be in the show notes and all that stuff. But so I'm going to pick just out of a few of these, all right, rather than just going through all of them. But I'm so glad that you already mentioned that, because to me, I think that's one of the big ideas in the book. It's also one of the things that I believe in a deep and profound level, that to be a more effective leader, mindset matters a whole lot.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just going to say some of the first 3 pieces that you talk about in the model are purpose, role, expectation, and vision. And I just want you to talk about what's the difference between purpose and vision in your model.
So yeah, it's a great question. And so part of the model has been developed over about 12 or 13 years ago. But the idea of it being authentic is that if you base it in some of your fundamental beliefs, then it allows you to lead in an authentic way. And when you lead in an authentic way, it's much more sustainable, right? If I try and lead like someone else, it doesn't work. So purpose for me is a fundamental drive about what's the impact you want to have in your life, right? Where do you want to have that impact? It's much more holistic. Vision is about, what do I want to do in this role, right? So what do I want to accomplish in this role?
So sorry to interrupt. So if I've read your book and followed your process, there are some of these pieces I'm probably not going to touch again. And there are others of them that I would.
Yeah.
And that's one of the differences here between my purpose, and the vision for me in this role. Fair?
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that, but what I will say is that the development of the model is iterative, right? So you would always go back and say, okay, so here's my vision. Does this align with my purpose, right? Because if my vision is not aligned with my purpose, then it's not really going to be sustainable. It's not going to be energy filling. It's going to be energy draining. And so is my role expectation aligned with my purpose, right? So you want to, it's that iterative process where you go back to the things that you fundamentally believe that are true about you, that make it authentic and make it sustainable.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. So the fourth of the pieces is priorities. And I want to put this up here because, one of the things you talk about at the beginning of the book in your story, and you've already mentioned it here, is that one of the symptoms is the calendar is so full. And in your story, right, the calendar's full for the next 6 months, right? Like, So let's just talk about priorities. One of the things that I always tell people about priorities is that when you look at the root of the word, there was no plural.
Right.
The root of the word priority, there was no plural version. And yet we talk about
Right.
priorities, and we talk about 6, 8, 10, 12 priorities, which of course there can't be. So talk about priorities. And then I want to talk about your formula. So we'll go there in a second. But like when you think about priorities in the authentic leadership model, what guidance would you give us to think about that more clearly?
Yeah, I mean, I think priorities is really interesting. I'm, as you know, Kevin, when you write a book, it's constantly evolving. So the model for the leadership shock and the authentic leadership model, I think, has continued to evolve. And it might, so instead of priorities, it might be better for people to understand it more as focus, right? So in other words, it's like, because in any role that we have, we only have limited degrees of freedom. There are certain things that we have to do, right? There are things that you have to do in the role that are required, whether it's for governance or whether it's through organizational structure or your boss's, and that's what the role expectation is supposed to capture. But outside of that, you actually do have some agency about where you spend your energy and spend your time. And so the question becomes, what are the areas of focus and therefore the priorities, right, that you want to spend your time on? And these can be pretty dynamic, right? And so when you think about it, you say, hey, we have purpose, and this is sort of when we kind of get to the formula, but we have purpose, we have role expectation, we have vision. Using those three inputs, I should be able to identify where do I need to look at my priorities, and in most cases, it's the new things, right? Or it's the things that I'm not going to focus on, right? So it's sort of like when you think about priorities, it's here are three things that I am going to do, and here are three things that I'm not going to do.
Yeah, it's the not to do list as much as
it's the not to do list,
right? And so I love this. And in fact, this, I often say, having done this show so long and having the great blessing to talk to so many really smart people like you, Pete, one of the things I always try is like, what's one thing I'm going to remember from a book? And it isn't necessarily the biggest idea in the book sometimes,
right?
But it's something that I will always try to take with me. And to me, in this case, this may be it, right? Purpose plus vision plus role expectations equals priorities. Because so often, and I love the way you started with the things that probably you don't have much freedom around,
right?
The stuff that's set from the organizational perspective. And again, the higher you go, especially, right? Here's governance issues. Here's things you got to do. But there's always some freedom in what do you do with the rest of it. And again, as you said earlier, so often the shock is so big because we have a lot of comfort zone.
Right.
And
I mean, I'll give you, yeah, Kevin, I'll just give you an example right now. I'm working with a leader. And one of the challenges you have is that when you're promoted from within, and you become the head of you were head of finance, and now you're the head of the business unit. Your tendency is to still do the finance role, right? Your tendency is to go to what got you successful and where you have your expertise. The goal of the authentic leadership model is to break that, to say, no, that is no longer the value that you provide, right? You are no longer the finance expert, right? Now you can, you've hired someone to do that job. Let them do that job. You can help them, but your job is no longer to run the finance department. And I see that a lot where people come in and they continue to do their old job as well as their current job. And that's why they're working 80 hours a week.
So there's two issues here. One issue is that sometimes you take the new job and the other job hasn't been filled yet, which is the story.
That is true. that
so
is
you're
true.
Forced to do it, but that isn't always the case. And I always say to people, like, when you get promoted, what are you reading now? Like, if you're using your example, if you're still reading the finance magazines, you got to be really careful. Like, if you want to read those, that's okay, but they shouldn't be at the top of the stack, right? You need to be reading something. You need to be reading the industry stuff. You need to be reading something else. You need to be reading Pete's book. You need to be watching this podcast. My point is the inputs have to change because the inputs are going to have so much to do with the outputs.
Yeah, and I would actually argue, and there's a really interesting model on vertical leadership development. And vertical leadership development says you have to open your aperture
Yep.
to new parts of information, right? You have to have a broader information. When you go from the head of finance to the head of the business unit, as the president of the business unit, you actually have to have a lot more data than you had before, and you have to find ways to be able to access that. And that can also be a source of leadership shock, because what happens is you get just paralyzed by everything that happens, right? Because now you have so much information, it's all data you haven't seen before, and it's really challenging. And so I love that idea of like, what are you reading? Because it really links to opening up that aperture, and it breaks a habit, right? It breaks a habit of what you've done in the past, and it opens up new opportunities to develop new habits.
So one more thing on that point, and I will absolutely get this number wrong. And if someone who's watching live has the right number, you can put it in there. But the famous line from Warren Buffett is how many hours a day he's reading, and it's like 6 or 8 or whatever. The number doesn't matter, except that it's so much bigger than any of ours. And so my point is, and it could be reading, could be listening. Like my point is, if you say I don't have time for any of that, there's no way you can be leading effectively, because if you're not spending time taking in new stuff and thinking, especially as you get higher in the organization, like, and so if you're not making time for that, if that's not part of that priority, there's a problem.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, because in the work that I do with executives, and you read about it in the book, like when I start working with someone in shock, the hardest thing is to find time to meet them, right? like you actually just can't find. They're literally like, well, I would like to meet you. I'm working with someone now. I spoke to them at the beginning of March. They want to work with me. Like, we're talking about June. And I'm just like, okay,
that they are the right client, though.
That's right. I'm like, okay, you're someone I should work with. And the trick is, once, so there's really an application, a very tactical application piece, right? That comes out when you get your priorities and you get your areas of focus. And that is an analysis of your calendar, right? And you go through your calendar and you say, how much time am I spending on my areas of focus? Like, how much time am I spending on the areas I don't want to focus on, and who am I delegating that to? Like it's not that work isn't going to get done, but it's really, I need to empower someone else to do that. So if I'm that president of the business unit and I came from finance, I need to make sure someone can do that finance thing, so I don't have to worry about that finance thing, right? And it can become really powerful. I mean, I remember I worked with a CEO, and he had 18 direct reports when I started working with him. And after he'd done his authentic leadership model and he had his prioritizations, he elevated the COO role, and he had 6. And the CEO had 12, right? Like, because he's like, that all that stuff that's over there on operations, that's not where I want to spend my time. That is not where my focus is. It's not the impact that I want to have in my role. And being really intentional about what's the impact you want to have means not doing some things so you can find time to do that impact.
So we are already running shorter of time than I would like to for us to have been. There's 3 more parts to the model: the value that I bring, beliefs, and principles. And I told myself I want to make sure we talked about beliefs and principles. So talk about each. And again, I'm going to kind of do it like I did with earlier. Tell us the difference between my leadership beliefs and my leadership principles.
So this is great. So this again makes the whole model it has to work together, right? Because the vision and my purpose, right? So we talked about that, and the role expectation means that there are certain outcomes I'm trying to get to, right? And therefore I need to change the kind of leader I am. So when we talk about leadership principles, we're really talking about what kind of leader do you want to be? But that kind of leader I want to be has to be founded in something that's true about myself. And what's true about myself are really 2 things. One is, what is my belief about leadership? So fundamentally, what do I believe great leaders do, right? And why do I think that? And because if I ground in my leadership beliefs, again, my leadership principles, the way I lead will be sustainable. And then the second thing is the value I provide. And the really interesting thing to me about the value that I provide, it's different than strengths, right? So I have strengths, I bring things to the table, but the value I provide is to this role. So if we go back to our fictional head of finance that becomes the president of the business unit, the value that he or she provided as the head of finance was financial expertise.
Yep.
But the value that they provide as the president of the business unit is not that.
It has to be something different.
It has to be something else. So you actually have to, with many of my clients, I have to help them think through, actually, what is the value? Like, my identity has been as a finance expert.
Yes.
Right. And so now I have to redefine that.
So I'm going to take that back a step, because this now relates to the next book that I'm working on right now. And that is that strengths are valuable, styles are valuable, but they can become an excuse, and they can become what we lean on. Like, well, I'm this kind of leader. Well, that may not serve you anymore. May not have ever served you as well as it could have, but it's very likely, especially in transition, may not serve you anymore. So useful to know, and yet, like, it's what we need to bring. We might have to flex, and if we're not able to flex, then we're going to have trouble. But but it's not flexing on beliefs and principles, right? It's flexing on approach. It's a flexing on focus.
Well, I think so. I don't think so. This is like, I have gone around and around on leadership principles. So because to me, leadership principles are for this role. It's like, how do I want to lead for this role? The beliefs, the way I'm describing it, the beliefs absolutely are static. The purpose is static, right? The role is dynamic, and the principles, which is the way I need to lead in this role to get to fulfill the vision that I'm trying to have. So, a great example, and we'll go back to our fictional finance. The head of finance, could have been quite directive in that role, right? Telling people what to do, to kind of. But now I'm the president of the business unit. I have to be a different leader, and therefore my principles of leadership that I'm applying right now can have. Now, Kevin, like I said, I've gone back and forth around principles. The way I've defined it is those are actually dynamic and can change. But I completely get when people read it, they're like, aren't principles static? To me, and this actually comes a little bit from my sports work. In like when I coached rugby, we would have a way that we wanted to play that had principles, but those principles would change, would evolve, right? From year to year. They wouldn't evolve from game to game. Those would be tactics, but the principles can evolve from year to year.
Principles evolve based on the style of play, based on the players that you have.
Exactly.
All of those things, right?
Exactly.
So I love that so much. So what we're talking about today, everybody, is the context of our work changes.
Right.
For lots of reasons. As we said, the shock can come because a lot of other stuff, the context is changing. But often, in most cases, and what we've talked about today, is when the context of your work has changed because your role has changed. Right. And then, one of the things about this model that I think is so valuable is that there are some things that don't change. Right. And there are many other things that, based on context, based on situation, based on role, must
completely change. Right.
And we must be clear about what changes and is unchanging, and what we must flex if we want to ultimately be successful.
So this is really about taking control. This is about taking control and spending some time so you can be really intentional about what you want to accomplish and how you want to accomplish it. And I think that intentionality is something that many leaders that I start working with, especially in Leadership Shark, but in general, people aren't as intentional. They don't have as much control. They have a lot more agency, a lot more leadership space to fill than they could, but they find themselves and they're just running, and they're running, and they don't know where they're running to, and they don't know how they're supposed to run, but they're just running. And so finding the moment to be able to stop. And this is probably the big thing I would say is when you read the book has embedded in it, it's kind of like a self-help book. Right? At the end of each chapter, you can work through these different pieces. And the only thing I ask is you just give yourself space to do that in a meaningful way, right? This is not a trivial exercise to be authentic and to really understand. It has to take time.
And if you don't take time, you won't get there.
Right.
You just won't.
It's an investment.
I've got a couple other questions to ask you before we
sure.
finish. Pete, one is, and I'm shifting gears now because I think that we just put a pretty good bow on our conversation and on the book and the big ideas that we want to talk about today. So I have a couple other things before we go. One is basically two questions I always ask. And the first one is, Pete, what do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? So first of all, I love the work that I do. Love it. Like when people talk about retirement, I don't understand how I would retire. But probably the most fun thing is stuff I do with my kids. I'm a late starter when it comes to kids. So I have a 4-year-old and 7-year-old. So that is probably one of the most fun things. But I actually like trying new things. So I actually like just doing things that I don't know I can do. Like I learned to ski at 47, never skied before, and now I can ski. And now I'm wondering, I'm like pickleball. Let me try pickleball. Like, and then I'm probably gonna get bored of pickleball, but like trying new things that I haven't done before are things that I like that because I like it forces me to grow. And so both my kids, which is always all new because every moment you interact with them, it's new stuff. But then actually doing new things is probably something that is most fun for me.
And the only thing you knew I was going to ask you is this question, which is, what are you reading these days? Or what's something you've read recently, Pete?
So I have 3 books like on my desk that I've started. I don't finish books, which is a real problem. And I actually wrote Leadership Shock so it could be finished. So it's a story. Business books definitely not. Like I read 2/3 of it and I've got it. Like I don't generally finish the business books. So it's a fable. So hopefully, and there's a twist at the end. So if you're going to buy it, there's a twist at the end of the story. Read till the end. But there's 3. So there's one that's called Science Fiction. So I'm a failed academic, failed scientist. So I love data. And science fiction is about, unfortunately, how you can't really trust any academic research. So it's by a guy called Stuart Ritchie. Really interesting book about the biases that exist in academia. And he has a great show called The Studies Show. It's a great podcast if you want to learn about like so it's really what do the studies show about ... So really interesting stuff. Rereading Legacy. Legacy is a book about the All Blacks, which is the New Zealand rugby team. It's the most successful sports franchise in the world. They've won 86. It's a great book about culture building. And so I'm rereading that right now. And then on my book that I haven't started is a book called Slow Horses, which is an Apple TV British spy series, which is amazing. And so I thought I'd grab the book and I would read it. So that's my fiction.
All 3 of those books, along with Leadership Shock, will be in the show notes. So you can get links to all those. Hope that you will do exactly that. So the question, Pete, that you probably wanted me to ask the very most since the start is, so where can we connect with you, learn more about what you're up to, learn more about this book? Where do you want to point people?
Well, I love it when people connect with me on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn's probably a good spot to kind of capture kind of like some of my thinking. You can go to petesteinberg.com. I have a newsletter that comes out that dives deep into Leadership Shock. So you can definitely find me there. So those are probably the 2 best places. If you want to follow some rugby commentary, then you can follow me on Twitter, which is at PJ Rugby 9, but I'm not sure that that's really, I don't know that this is the right audience.
You never know. You just never know, Pete.
You never know.
And you hinted to me that there's a podcast series that you're going to host coming out.
There is a podcast series that will be coming out.
Sure.
Yeah.
At PeteSteinberg.com.
Called Leadership Shock. Yeah. And it'll be on petesteinberg.com. Thank you.
All right. So everybody, now I have a question for all of you before we go. The question that I ask you every week. And it's simply 2 words. Now what? So you've had the chance to listen to our banter for the last 30 minutes or so. You've had the chance to get some really good ideas to consider. We've talked about things like priorities and focus and outcomes and beliefs and principles and the differences. We've talked about strengths. We've talked about styles. We've talked about Leadership Shock. But it's the question for you is, what are you going to do with what you got? Because if you don't take some action, just as Pete said, at the end of every chapter, there's action to take. If you don't take some action from this, hopefully, I hope that you found it engaging. I hope that you found it enjoyable. I hope you found it interesting. But what I think both Pete and I would hope most is that you would take action on what you learned, whether it's buying the book or whether it's taking some action based on one of the ideas that we shared, whether it's thinking about setting your priorities based on purpose plus vision plus role expectations, or whatever it is, I hope that you will take some action for having been here. And I hope you'll be back next week, because we're here every week, right? So you should come back every week to the next episode of the podcast. And if you're in terms of live, you'll find us if you get connected, or when we'll be back live as well. Pete, thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Kevin, it was great. Love the conversation.
And everybody, if you liked it, do come back and go give us a recommendation. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes, because every week we'll be back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everyone.